Welcome back to the Conclusion of the Matter podcast. This is Ryan Weaver. With me today are Robbie Santiago and Ren Ferguson. The conclusion of the matter is what we call this thing. So we try to get to the end of things.
If you haven't picked up on that
Maybe
yet.
not in one episode, but maybe two, or in Revelation's case, 3,
Yeah.
8.
8.
Sorry, I meant to say 8, but I don't know why I said 3. But anyway, as Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Again, thank you for tuning in, those in TV land, those on Godcast land. And
I'd almost forgot about that.
yeah, I did too. Anyway, I'll just go ahead and kick it over to Robbie and let him introduce what we're going to talk about, and we'll dive right in.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks, Ryan. And as always, if you have questions, send those in, and we'll start preparing for next season so we can get those answered hopefully sooner rather than later.
Season finale.
Yep. The grand finale.
You know, I had lost track of time because I was going to get y'all a book for the season finale, and maybe I could still do it. But it was a book I found on Amazon because y'all always give me such a hard time for saying synecdoche. And it's like the word you need to know or should know to sound smart. And so I'll have to get that for you guys and give it
I
to
bet
y'all.
that word's not in there, though.
Well,
I don't give you a hard time. It's just I don't ever remember what it means. So
we're too stupid for that book. Anyway, today we are going to, I guess you can call this a part 2. We're going to kind of continue in a similar fashion as last week in the book of Daniel, but we're going to jump ahead to chapter 7. And we really hit chapter 8 last week for the most part, too, I guess, and in a quick little commercial. But chapter 7 is going to be another vision. If you recall from last week, we looked at the vision of the four, basically the image of the 4 different, well, not 4 statues, 1 statue, 4 different parts, head of bronze,
head of gold.
Here, we're off to a great start.
It's getting late. We're tired.
Head of gold, silver kind of torso area, and then getting into bronze, and then the legs being of iron, and the feet being partly of iron and partly of clay. So mentioning from the Chaldeans / Babylonians to the Medo-Persians to the Greeks to the Romans to the Byzantines / Romans. But we're going to jump ahead to chapter 7 and look at the next major vision that Daniel's going to interpret. So Daniel chapter 7, verse 1, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came out of the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion and had an eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And that's all it said about the first beast. But the first beast, again, an eagle with its wings plucked off. Many people think this is symbolic of Nebuchadnezzar / the Babylonians as well, because essentially his empire, the Babylonian / Chaldean empire, is going to be kind of plucked off as well. But what thoughts do you guys have on the Babylonians, or just the first part of the vision there?
Oh, I was just going to add that to add credence to the idea that this is Babylon. Babylon in other passages, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, is described as an eagle and a lion in different passages. I've got Isaiah 5 and verse 29, Jeremiah 4 and verse 7, Jeremiah 48 and verse 40, and Ezekiel 17 and verse 3. Those references there refer to Babylon either as a lion or an eagle or something like that. So that's why, well, one of the reasons why. And I think as we go through, we'll see it more clearly, that being reference to Babylon.
Anything else you got, Ryan?
No, I just thought it was interesting. Nebuchadnezzar had kind of like wings when he was his hair had grown like feathers.
Yeah.
I don't know that has anything to do with it, but these feathers were plucked off, and his were eventually, even though it was hair, but it said like feathers. So, anywho,
right. And again, I'll just kind of refresh the relative dates for when some of these things are taking place. Daniel's written in approximately 540 BC, and then give or take a few years after that, 550 BC. Is kind of starting where Persia is going to begin kind of coming onto the scene. Nebuchadnezzar was reigning, I believe, from about 605 BC on. And did you guys have anything else on?
And this was after Nebuchadnezzar anyway.
Yeah.
So this is, but still, that kingdom was what he was referring to. It was
the
still,
Chaldeans.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anything else that you guys want to add before we go on? All right. Well. We left off here in verse 5, and suddenly another beast, a second like a bear, it was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, arise, devour much flesh. So just one verse on the second image there. Probably going to be referencing kind of similar fashion to last week. We're moving on to kind of our next major kingdom, which would be the Persians. This could also be specifically talking about Cyrus, just because at the end there it's talking about devouring much flesh, about like the true expansion of the Persian Empire. And most of that expansion, or most of the development of the Persian Empire, was done under the supervision of King Cyrus. And there's going to be other leaders that come after him, such as Darius and King Xerxes that we mentioned last week, that was married to Esther. So there's going to be other kings of Persia that come along, but the one that really spearheads the empire as a whole is going to be King Cyrus.
Yeah.
We also mentioned the prophecy about him in Isaiah chapter 44 and 45 from last week as well. So he's mentioned in different places in the Old Testament, and I believe he's mentioned in either Ezra or Nehemiah. I believe it's probably Ezra.
Yeah.
And then I think Nehemiah references Darius.
And he's also mentioned in 2 Chronicles.
Yes.
36.
Okay. What do you guys have on the second beast?
I was just going to bring up how it mentions that the bear was raised up on one side. There's a couple of different interpretations of that. One is like his paw was raised up, like he's ready to attack, very aggressive. Or the other interpretation is more so, maybe for lack of a better term, that one side was enlarged, indicating
like
kind of going
horns
back
of
to the horns, that one side was more powerful and stronger than the other, which goes back to what we talked about in the last episode. And then the 3 ribs, which you talked about that in chapter 8, the 4 directions of its expansion, westward, northward, and southward. And the kingdoms that I've seen kind of generally ascribed to that are Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. Some will include Media in that. So again, slight.
Depends on your interpretation of the one side being raised up.
So this commentary about the 3 ribs says indicative of finishing a meal.
Yeah.
Like maybe this empire is starting to rev up its engine a little bit, and now he's being told, go eat a bunch of stuff. So we're starting to see the beginnings, I think, because Nebuchadnezzar's gone, Belshazzar, his son, who some even question if he was really a king in power.
Yeah.
He had some authority there, and I think Daniel even called him king there. But I'm talking, if you read historically, some people question if they were on their way out. And it's clear that the Medes had started, the Medo-Persians had probably started to, it had to start somewhere, and I think this is indicative of the beginning.
Of the beginning of their end?
The beginning of the Medo-Persian is beginning their feast, per se.
Yeah. Gotcha.
They had their hors d'oeuvres, their 3 ribs, and now they're told to go. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Anything else you guys have on the third beast?
Nope.
All right. Well, I guess we can go ahead.
Second beast. We haven't done the third beast.
Yeah,
right now.
I'm sorry. I was beginning to segue into the third beast. Sorry. My mouth was faster
I was
than
like,
my brain.
wait, I don't remember talking about him.
Yeah, all done with that one real fast. So the third beast, starting here in verse 6. After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. Many, and we kind of referenced some of this last week as well, think this is indicative of the Macedonian Empire / the Greek Empire, but specifically Alexander the Great, because his empire is going to be split into the 4 parts among the 4 generals, and that gets into chapter 8 a little bit as well. So what do you guys have on the third beast?
Well, I think it's interesting that he chooses a leopard to represent Greece, because to go back to your point earlier, in the last episode, the rapid expansion of the Greek Empire, kind of being represented there in the leopard with its speed and agility, I guess.
That was the note I was going to point out too. So yeah.
Yep. Well, that's kind of, I think we hit on most of this last week, but really, a lot of this is hit on in chapter 8 about Alexander the Great, how we also, it's kind of like a repeating itself. Chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8, kind of mentioning the Greek Empire / Alexander the Great / Macedonia, how they're going to come in and conquer Persia. They're going to come and pretty much utterly destroy everything in sight. And then chapter 8 also kind of harps on that fact, but also that it's going to be divided into 4 parts that we now know among his 4 generals, and that one of those 4 generals is going to kind of eventually over time dominate for a little bit of time, be really corrupt, and eventually that empire is going to come to an end too. So I think all these 3 chapters really kind of complement one another. And
I think so. I think 2 and 7 stand out to me because of the mention of the eternal kingdom and who's going to be given and especially in this chapter, who's given the authority over that eternal kingdom.
Exactly. Yep. Probably the most important part was, as we'll kind of get into. Okay. Well, if you guys don't have anything else on the third beast,
leopard,
I guess we will go on to the fourth beast. Okay. So we left off in verse 7 here. After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all of the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So, given the fact that it mentions kind of iron in there, it's somewhat obvious that this would be indicating the Roman Empire that we also mentioned in chapter 2 last week, and part of the big image of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And also that it mentions that it was, very powerful, very dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, the iron teeth, devouring, trampling things, different than all the others before it. So Rome, I would say kind of a good way to put Rome is kind of like, it's kind of a culmination of a lot of these. So it took like the Greek Empire, it wasn't like necessarily a military empire, taking out like Alexander the Great, of course, but the Greek Empire's real strength was really kind of like the cultural side of it. So bringing that in, but also Alexander the Great's military might, but then also aspects of, Persia and all of these. Rome, like Ryan mentioned, they weren't necessarily out to destroy everyone necessarily either. They just wanted peace. So even a lot of the places that they conquered, they let a lot of the local rulers kind of remain in place and just essentially put like a supervisor in that area. So once they conquer them, they're like, hey, you can be one of us, just, behave yourselves, essentially. Yeah. And we're going to, come in and build some roads and, organize our government and stuff. But you can still kind of, live a pretty peaceful life.
And we see that at the trial of Jesus.
Exactly.
Where Pilate was like, I got to do something because they're gonna
Yeah.
and they're gonna
Yeah.
get a riot, and basically he realizes he's gonna be in trouble because he was one of those guys put in place
That was the
to
one
keep
thing.
the peace.
One
So,
thing that they were responsible for is just, just don't let a riot
Yeah.
happen, essentially.
one
but-
job you had, one job, pilot.
But
Anyway.
that's why I lost my chain of thought. I started thinking of a movie quote there, but the Romans really wanted just like not necessarily like direct control. They wanted the final say, and as long as things weren't getting like unruly, where there was going to be like a riot or something that was going to, that they were going to have to take their time to come in and resolve. They were pretty much fine, and that's why I remember what I was going to say. You have like kings like Herod that's still going to have like relative political power in the area, and that was pretty common for a lot of what they called Roman provinces at the time. And even what a lot of times they would do is to gain military experience. You would have not always a consul, but like a military leader. A centurion is not exactly the same as this, but a pretty high-ranking one that they thought was going to establish a political career. They would kind of give them military experience, conquer an area, but then give them administrative experience in the process of that. Augustus Caesar is a prime example of that, because the Roman government had kind of different facets. You had the most important part was obviously the Roman Senate, which most of them there was kind of like an election process, but there were kind of two parts within there where you had poor people and commoners called plebeians, and then you had patricians, who were generally your rich people and or career politicians or descendants or relatives of those kind of people. But then you also had some other division of different groups like praetors and tribunes. So the Roman government had kind of different offices, and even people like Pilate, that they had kind of different Roman government officials that were in charge of various things. I think praetors were kind of like to vouch for like the commoner's interest or like for a particular area's interest. Tribunes, I forget exactly what tribunes. They may have kind of been somewhat tied to the military somehow. But consuls, you essentially had two consuls. And the reason you had two is so that you didn't have a dictatorship. So I guess it was fine to have like a dual dictatorship, basically like an oligarchy. But the consuls ended up kind of having most of the power of Rome, but they just served for, I believe, 1-year terms. And most of the time they were supposed to be solely in charge of the military. But what was the most important part of the Roman Empire? The military, right? So generally they had the most political power that was sometimes checked by the Roman Senate, but in people like Augustus Caesar's case, not so much, which is why in some parts of Rome it's considered a dictatorship there. But anyway, all of Rome's government was kind of divided into different facets, and you had different politicians doing different things. Kind of like in America, how we have governors, mayors, senators, representatives, state senators, state representatives, even like aldermen's, councils. Like we have all kinds of different elected officials or non-elected officials in some cases that can be appointed. And Rome was, I wouldn't say as complicated as America, but obviously, Rome's government influenced ours. We don't have time to talk about that, but there's a lot of similarities there. So, but Rome's military being the number one aspect of them that we can see pretty clearly in this vision there. And the part kind of going on to the part about the 10 horns, unless you guys had something else.
I was just going to bring up that again, he does not draw an analogy between Rome and an actual animal. He just describes them as a beast. He doesn't name a leopard or a bear or a lion like all the other ones. But it also reminds me of our study of Revelation, because you read of the dragon and the beast representing their Rome, as we've talked about in those episodes. And so I just think it's interesting that the symbolism is parallel between this and what we see even in the book of Revelation.
As I was reading this, it's like a lot of the language is really similar. So, okay, Ryan, anything else about Rome or that part?
Not that part, no.
Okay. Well, I'll kind of reread the part that we were kind of getting into. At the end of verse 7, it says that it was different from all the beasts that were before, and it had 10 horns. And the 10 horns is kind of talking about the early history of Rome from basically the time after Julius Caesar, essentially. But after him, you have the 5 Caesars, Augustus Caesar, and then you have Tiberius, who, ironically, Julius had to adopt Augustus to get a male heir, essentially, and Tiberius was pretty much the same for Augustus too. And the verse, I believe it's in, I want to say like Mark 11:37, that says, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar."
Yeah.
I may have the wrong reference for that, but that's what the verse says. When he's talking about paying taxes, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. That's actually the Roman Caesar that it's talking about is Tiberius Caesar, not Augustus Caesar or Julius, the more common ones. But little tidbit. And then you have Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Nero really gets the bad reputation. But I would also say
rightfully deserved.
Yeah, rightfully deserved. But Caligula was another one that was pretty
Yeah.
that was pretty bad too.
And so was Domitian after Vespasian and Titus.
Yes, and those were the ones that I was going to kind of get to.
Yeah.
The 10 after Nero, you have kind of this period where you have emperors that are not Caesars come in to be kind of essentially the dictators of Rome. Galba, Otho, Aulus Vitellius, and then Vespasian. Okay, those 4, none of them ruled for a really long time. So we're going to get into that here in just a moment. But Galba ruled for essentially 1 year, 68 to 69, and then Otho lasted about 3 or 4 months, from January to April. I assume that would be under the Julian calendar, which is the one that we follow.
Yeah.
So I don't have any reason to believe it would be different.
Also a Roman carryover.
Yeah.
Yeah. Julian calendar, Julius Caesar, for those wondering what Ryan's talking about. And then after Otho, you have Aulus Vitellius from basically a few months after Otho in July until December. So all of these essentially within like a year or two. And then Vespasian is the 4th, and he rules for about 10 years, kind of stabilizes everything. But as you can kind of infer from all of this, there's a little bit of civil war going on, where everybody, including the Roman Caesars, are getting killed.
Because weren't those men? I know Galba was, and I think Otho was, but weren't all of those men generals?
Yes,
And it was basically,
I think they all were.
and because it was basically, from my understanding, when Nero died, it was like all of these different groups of the military were like, "Hey, our generals,
they made
he's the
'cause
emperor now."
Yeah, because the guy, I was just reading that where he had sent Vespasian to go.
Yeah.
The Jews had made some sort of riot. I don't remember where, but he had sent Vespasian off, and he got word, and all his men were like,
Yeah.
"Oh, you're the emperor." So yeah,
Yeah.
but all the other ones were very similar.
Right.
Those 4, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the 10 horns are basically a list of the first 10 Caesars there. So dating back from Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, the Caesars, and then the next 4, Galba, Otho, Aulus Vitellius. I'm probably still mispronouncing that,
That's
even though I
fine.
slowed down, and Vespasian. And we'll get into the others maybe another time. But back to Daniel chapter 7 here, verse 8, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. So this one's kind of a little bit more down in the weeds, where there's a little bit less certainty, but my best guess for this one would probably be Vespasian, because you have those 4 emperors essentially within a year or two of each other, and he's the 4th one that comes to kind of stabilize things for a span of 10 years. So that's kind of my 2 cents. I don't know if you guys read any conflicting points of
not
view.
really.
But the point there is Vespasian, this commentary, Vespasian and his son brought severe hardship upon Israel, the people of God, even more so than some of the others. So,
Well, it was under them that but Jerusalem was destroyed.
yeah.
Because because Titus was Vespasian's son, and Titus was also a general, and Vespasian sent Titus to Jerusalem to besiege it, and ultimately they destroyed it. So yeah, they had a lot of run-ins with the Jews, I guess you could say.
And you can also kind of see at the end of 8 there that he had a mouth speaking pompous words. So like,
Which
it's kind
is
of the
something-
typical.
Yeah, which is something I
Well-
wanted to bring up, because when you mentioned Revelation, we talked about that quite often was the emperor worship,
Yeah.
and them being not only glorifying themselves but other people glorifying them, and I think we see some of that here.
Yeah.
And not only talking about Vespasian, but especially I think like Nero and some of these, and the Romans weren't unique to this. I mean, you have several groups: the Egyptians, Mayans, Aztecs, Inca. Well, maybe not the Mayans. I believe the Mayans, but definitely the Aztec and the Inca. A lot of your Sumerians, Babylonians. Not necessarily talking about the Chaldeans, but like the original Babylonians. You have several of those Mesopotamian kingdoms, all of these different groups and several others that I listed too. Many of them believe that their leader, their emperor, was kind of a descendant of gods or was like a god
yeah.
themselves. So that was definitely not like an uncommon thing for those to be worshipped because they were, I mean, even if you take religion out of it, they were already kind of put on a pedestal in all of these cases. I mean, take Nebuchadnezzar, for example. And all these kings, even how they're talked about in the Bible, when they're addressed, oh, king, and just real like kind of bending a knee to how they were spoken to, even when we read about in the Bible. I mean, it was obviously magnified on a secular sense, just how they were put on a pedestal. So when you factor that in, it's no wonder that a lot of these emperors were expecting to be treated or worshipped like God.
Well, if we fast forward to, and I probably shouldn't, but I'm going to, we'll come back to it, but fast forward to verse 25 where the beast is being interpreted, it's talking about this little horn feller, and it says, he shall speak words against the Most High. So he's going to speak against God, and then he's going to say, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. He's going to put them through the ringer, and I think that's pretty clear that they're gonna be worn out, and it's not, from a workout. It's he's talking about really putting the hammer to them. Anyway,
well, because a lot of Christians, going back to like Matthew 24, a lot of Christians were displaced from Jerusalem too when it was destroyed in AD 70. So just and even as Christ describes that in Matthew 24, he talks about how hard that's going to be on the Christians.
Yeah, because he's like, flee for the mountain and all that stuff.
And hope that you're not pregnant and hope that it's not in the winter.
Yeah.
Well, that's most of what I had for that section. Are you guys?
Yeah, we're good.
Well, I guess just a quick little historical tidbit. We talked about the first 10. After the first 10, you have a few other pretty decently well-known Roman emperors like Emperor Titus and Domitian. We kind of mentioned Domitian a couple minutes ago, but he's not the nicest Roman empire by any stretch of the imagination. But after him, you have a period in Rome that was generally referred to not necessarily as the Pax Romana, but a period of relative peace called the Five Good Emperors. And you have Emperor Nerva, starting in about 96 AD, and this period goes from about then until about 180. But the five good emperors were Nerva, and then Trajan, who I mentioned last week, and Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is probably out of those five considered one of the best ones too. Trajan as well, but all of these
He's
are
also in the Gladiator movie.
Exactly, yeah. So a lot of these are pretty well known.
Someone portrayed him.
Yes,
he wasn't
his
in it.
character.
He came back from the dead. A couple others later. Commodus is another one that's somewhat well known. I mentioned Emperor Diocletian that was kind of ruling around like 185-ish, kind of right in the middle of that, or 285, I'm sorry. I may have said 185 last week. I can't remember. But anyway, he kind of skimming through some of these other ones. Yeah, most of the rest of these are not super. There's kind of another period of civil war where there's some kind of division going on in a lot of short reigns. But Diocletian's probably the next relevant one, and he rules from 284. Ironically enough, when he splits that empire in 285, he takes the eastern half. So he kind of sees the writing on the wall for the western part. And then I won't go through all of these, but probably the next most famous one would probably be Constantine, who legalized Christianity.
Yeah.
Mostly talking about Roman Christianity more so than actual Christianity. But regardless, I guess we can go on to the interpretation if you guys are good.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're talking about verse 9.
Pretty much the transition into the next part. So verse 9, I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. You guys got some things to say about those couple verses?
I mean, just the Ancient of Days there, which I think it'll be explained more in verses 13 and following, talking about God the Father being represented here. It's the one to whom the Son of Man, which is an important phrase, which we'll get into later, is going to be presented there. But just a depiction of the throne room, I guess you could say.
Yep. And again, kind of we mentioned this earlier, it is kind of pretty similar language, if you will, from when we were going through Revelation 2. Well, I'll go ahead and keep reading in 11 and finish the section here. I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beast, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one which shall never be destroyed. So just like we talked about with Daniel chapter 2, and another similarity we see here, that it wraps up this vision by proclaiming that the kingdom of God, the one that Christ is going to establish, is going to be one that's eternal, that's going to be that's never going to be destroyed. That again, it's a spiritual kingdom, not a physical one. And unlike these other kingdoms that are temporary, that putting your hope in this kingdom is what's ultimately going to be worthwhile, instead of relying on, strength and power and might. Relying on God and the kingdom of heaven is what's really going to give you eternal life. So what else do you guys have on the kind of last part of the vision?
Interesting that Son of Man is used. I mean, Christ referred to himself as that multiple times.
I think that's, if I remember correctly, I think that's the name that he refers to himself by the most.
Really?
Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, it's pretty clear because then he's given the kingdom.
Yeah.
And we know that he is the head of the kingdom, and we see that in the head of the body, which is the kingdom. We've done that in other episodes, so we're not going to. I'm not going to dive into those verses. But New Testament, we see the body of Christ is the church, is the kingdom, all three, and he's the head of it. So it's pretty clear who is being referred to here.
Yeah.
Which you alluded to a few minutes ago, anyway.
Yeah.
So
and by using this term in the New Testament, well, in the gospel accounts, Jesus is identifying himself as the Messiah. And it's also interesting because in verse 13 it says there came one like a son of man, which would indicate that he's not entirely human. It's not just a man.
the form of
It's something greater than a man. And so Jesus the whole time, though he wasn't, the only time that I am aware of where he explicitly declares that he is the Messiah is to the woman at the well in John 4. I could be forgetting one or another. But all the times that he refers to himself as the Son of Man, he's calling himself, in an indirect way, calling himself the Messiah. And again, going back to the point y'all made about his rule and authority and power.
Okay. Anything else?
No.
All right. Okay. Well, let's go down to, I was going to jump down to 17 unless you guys had something about 15 or 16. I was just going to speed it up a little bit. So basically this is where it's being interpreted. Those great beasts which are four kings, which arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever and ever. Kind of the point that we just made, that these four kings that are secular are ultimately going to come and go, but the kingdom that Christ is going to establish, though not a physical kingdom, is going to be more powerful and last forever, and none of them are going to be...
What I find interesting is we're going to possess it. I mean, we're fellow heirs. I think that's another thing that needs to be called out is, as we talked about, I think in the last episode, is that it's not a, as you said, a forced. This is one that, you know, we're fellow heirs of. We're not the king of it, but we are heirs of this kingdom. Anyway,
unlike any of the secular kings, I mean, you know, whether we're talking about like us today or even if we were alive then, we probably would have been pretty insignificant politically in those
peasant.
Yeah, peasants. Okay, well, let's go ahead to 19. Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet, and the 10 horns which were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth, which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which shall be different than the other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings, who shall arise from this kingdom, so 10 kings, 10 Caesars. And another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and a half a time. But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume it and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and the dominions shall serve and obey him. So essentially, and the most important part of all of this, as well as chapter 2, is that Christ's kingdom is going to be superior and better than all of these other kingdoms, no matter, at the end of the day, just like we talked about with Revelation, at the end of the day, Christ's kingdom and being in Christ is what's going to, that's what's going to be worthwhile, that's going to last forever, that we can be partakers in, and that's going to be better than all of these other kingdoms, whether powerful or whether not powerful. So what do you guys have on... I guess the fourth beast part of this? We've kind of harped on really kind of a lot of it.
I don't think I really have anything to add.
I don't either, except for in 28th verse, the end of the matter. Yep. I mean, he uses a very, very similar, very similar to our theme verse. I thought that was interesting. So,
all right,
spin-off podcast.
All right. Okay. Well, if you guys don't have anything else, again, just to kind of recap, the first part, the lion was the Babylonians, and then the second part, which was kind of the bear type, was the Persians under King Cyrus, and then the leopard would be representative of the Greeks, Alexander the Great specifically, the Hellenistic period, and then the last one talking about the Romans, and then getting into the 10 Caesars / emperors, and then eventually... most likely talking about Vespasian. Another interpretation, I wonder if this could also be the case. So, but just the language doesn't really seem to match up. So in Rome's early history, like with the Caesars particularly, had a group of 3 politicians twice. You had the first triumvirate, which was Julius Caesar, and I should know this. I think it was Gaius Gracchus, maybe. I'll double check that. But then the second triumvirate was definitely Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Augustus Caesar. So the time that Jesus is beginning to walk on the earth and starting to begin his ministry is kind of like around that time of Augustus Caesar, give or take, and then kind of getting into Tiberius a little bit too. So maybe that, since it mentions 3 there, I don't think that it would be representative of Augustus, just because it mentions that it overtook 3 different ones. But the fact of the matter that Mark Antony kind of had like an alliance with Cleopatra could be like the third ruler, I guess, that was taken over. I would still lean toward the Vespasian than that, because that would be kind of getting, kind of trying to, look this way. All right, it's this.
Yeah.
But the first that was the second triumvirate with Augustus and Mark Antony and Lepidus, and then Augustus pretty much did the same thing, but kind of for a different reason. Mark Antony and Cleopatra tried to like kind of team up against them, sort of thing. But the first triumvirate was Julius Caesar for certain, and then you had Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Magnus. So, or no. What? I'm sorry. I shouldn't be going to Wikipedia. Here we go. Let's do a little bit more. Worldhistory.org. Yeah, Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. So that was your first triumvirate, and then again your second triumvirate was Augustus Caesar and Mark Antony and Lepidus. So I'm 100% certain on the second one. I just forgot everybody but Julius Caesar, because he basically took them over, and I forgot about him, just like history kind of forgot about him, I guess. So, but yes, so that's pretty much Daniel chapter 7's. I guess prophecy would kind of fit in here as well, but vision more specifically. So, anything else you guys have?
Don't think so.
Well, this is the grand finale, everyone. So we're going to be taking a little bit of time off for the summer to be prepping for next time and next season, and also catching our breath a little bit and getting relaxed and other things. So we encourage you to email us at the conclusion of the matter, or just let us know in person, or message us, or comment on our YouTube, or somehow or another. If you have questions or topic suggestions or comments, leave those for us, and also share this video or this audio recording, however you're listening to. Share it with your coworkers, your friends, your family, pets, whoever. But as for season number 6, and as for Daniel chapter 7, I guess you can consider this the conclusion of the matter.